This is the book. This is the 6th dictionary of occult manifestation. Only 4 copies exist in the world today. This one was stolen from the University of Heidelberg about 10 years after it was printed in 1832. I could go to jail for this, obviously, which is another reason you're not recording this. And I'm not using my name. And I can't answer any questions about where this came from. Good. The phenomenon that Ms. Hershbergen is talking about has only been referenced one time in print, and it's in here. The terminology is archaic, so, of course, the term lockbox is nowhere in here. Again, we're just starting here. I want you to see the grounding.
I was just driving by and I saw this place. It's all alone here on this little road with the garden over here. Where they were having like a spring fun fair. And I just had this feeling that it was where I wanted to be. Well, I'd move here and I'd attend this church and I'd work for it, and that's all I really wanted. It was just a feeling. So, it's exactly what I did.
At the age of 45, Ellen Hershbergen moved alone from Buffalo to the small town of Pontiac, New York. In April of 2013, she found a job at a Hallmark store 10 miles away and rented a tiny fixer-upper beside the woods. She settled into a simple routine of work and church activities. In May, she received a call from a cousin she barely knew, asking for her help.
Donna said to me, "We just can't take care of Winthrop anymore. He needs a place to stay and get settled. And Pontiac's perfect because he's going to have a job at the sheet metal plant. It's all arranged." I never even met Winthrop, but she sent me a couple of photographs. She said he was a good man, but he'd had some trouble in the army and used to drink, but that he didn't anymore. For a long time, he'd been sort of moving between family members out there in Elmira. So what could I say? I said yes, he should come and live in the spare room for a couple months, till he had the money to get a place in Angola. I didn't really think that much about it. It's what I thought families should do. I didn't go deeply into his past.
I've lived here, I don't know, 28 years or so. There's really nothing to do here. You have to go up to Angola to even get to a bar. And if you want to drink at a bar that isn't hooked to a bowling alley, you're going to need a plan, man.
I picked him up at the bus station, and he was just so quiet. He was real small and bald, but kind of muscular. It was very, very hard to have a conversation with him, but he was never rude. He didn't really have any money or any friends he kept up with. He was all alone. He watched a lot of TV during the day. He was waiting for his job to start up in a couple weeks. Mealtime was very quiet. He started going out late at night, just walking. He couldn't drive a car. We were going to have to get his license reinstated. I would wake up and look at the ceiling, and I'd sense that he was still out somewhere, but I never wanted to ask where that someplace was. He didn't have any real options in town. I think in the beginning he just walked as far as he could, then came back. I would hear the door open at 3, 4 a.m. He stayed in the tub a lot, too. He would go in there and stay for hours. And I thought, he just doesn't want to get out because there's nothing outside of it for him.
Ellen was an immense help to us from the first day she arrived. She had a very good sense for raising money for the church. But really, I would say that she was the most devoted parishioner that we had. Absolutely tireless.
On a Saturday after work, I walked down here along this path that leads from the house through the woods to the creek. I hadn't been on it for a while, and you can still see what was done to the bamboo patch here. I know it's horsetail, but I always think of it as bamboo. You see how every single stalk was broken at the midpoint? Hundreds of them. And then some of the smaller trees were chopped down. This one here, and here. No reason. The wood wasn't taken away or anything. It just looked like rage to me. I would ask him those first 2 weeks if he wanted to come to church with me, but he would say no. He was so withdrawn, just watching TV and sleeping. Didn't want to talk about the things he liked, or about the family even. Unless you really phrased things carefully. He had such a faraway, lost look in his eyes. One day, he finally did come. This was after the sheet metal plant called and said he couldn't start until August. But he stayed in the car. He rode with me to church, but then he wanted to stay in the car. I was sitting in service, and in the middle of it, I looked off out the window for a second. I remember it was a beautiful sunny day, and I could see the car, and Winthrop got out of it, and he was walking over to a stump kind of near the entrance to the cemetery. There was a squirrel sitting on top of it, kind of cowering. My impression was that it was really sick. And Winthrop went up to it very, very carefully, one little step at a time, and lifted it up in his hands very gently, and he walked away. He wasn't there when services let out, so I waited for a while, but I didn't see him again until almost dinner time. He'd walked the squirrel all the way to the hospital. 4 miles. But that was a regular hospital, and someone there had been good enough to drive the squirrel to the vet's, which had been so much closer.
I woke up because I had heard the porch creak. The boards are really ancient, and my bedroom's right near it. I don't even know what time it was, but I think it was after 2 or 3. It was still totally dark, and I got up and looked out, and I swear my heart almost stopped because there was a man just standing there on the porch at the top of the steps, like looking at me through the window, but not even caring. He looked like a salesman out there, but he didn't make any move to leave, so I poked my head out and yelled at him, and he turned real slow, didn't say a word, and walked across the yard and into the woods. But yeah, I knew who it was. I saw his face, and I called Ellen about it, and she was real sorry. I was like, what do you think he was doing there? And she didn't know. We all knew there was something really strange about him. We just weren't sure what. But finding him on my porch a mile away from where he lived, that was really terrifying.
That was Denise, who lived about a mile away. In the other direction, further down, well, that's where Vanna lived. She'd been there long before I got here. She started coming over in July, mostly on her bike. The first time she came over, she'd been in the hospital for most of the day. She told me everything about her life, every possible thing, about all her health problems. She was on disability for back injury and migraines and Lyme disease. You could recognize her from her hair. She liked to keep it almost down to her waist. She once told me she got it caught on her bicycle chain and it broke a bone in her neck. At first she was friendly, but it felt like there was something beneath it. Like she was challenging me sometimes, you know? Sometimes she wanted to stay over, even though her house was only 1.5 miles away. And of course she couldn't get to sleep unless she slept in my bed. Then she'd spend a good part of the next morning before going home. I was sometimes wary of her because she was the kind of person who always seemed to be on the verge of asking for money or some other favor. Or I was just scared of her telling me things I didn't want to know. Intimate things about her past and her family, and her father who had abused her. But she never quite did. There were episodes where she was obviously making fun of me because I wasn't educated, but she had less school than I even did. She really hated Winthrop from the beginning, and she was always telling me how dangerous he seemed. The mood between them was very tense. He never really even spoke to her. I don't know what they were like when I went off to work and Vaughn would stay in the house for a while with him. I can't imagine it. She warned me that he was a lot like a couple of boyfriends she'd had, capable of terrible things. She was always saying how he obviously wanted her, but she wouldn't have any of that. Well, she said that about almost all the men she knew.
Ms. Minter's record wasn't much more than a series of petty thefts and altercations dating back to when she was a teenager. 5 arrests in 20 years. She did have one far more unusual incident involving the possible false imprisonment of 2 young members of the Mormon Church. They'd been going around the neighborhood, as they do, in their shirts and ties, door to door, and she had allegedly locked these 2 men in her basement for almost 12 hours and had attempted to get them to perform sexual acts on her. That would have been a very serious charge, but the DA couldn't get the church to really cooperate, so it slipped through the cracks.
She'd say that Winthrop had guns, but I didn't think that was true. She'd say he was breaking into houses at night, but she had no evidence. It was enough to make me more afraid of both of them. But unlike Vona, Winthrop's situation just broke my heart. He'd been passed around the family for such a long time, for years and years, and it felt like no one wanted to know him or understand him. He was just a ball with no air in it that nobody wanted to play with. I hadn't heard from her in about a week, which was strange enough. But she'd borrowed my space heater, and I really needed it back because the shelter had a use for it. And she didn't have a phone, so as soon as I got home from work, I walked down the road to her house. Winthrop was in his room, but I didn't know where he'd been. When I asked him how his day was, he'd only said that he'd fixed the mailbox. It had kept almost tipping over. It was 8:15 or thereabouts. I'd never been over to Vanna's. She lived on a couple acres like I did, like a lot of people in Pontiac did. So much space. The yard was really overgrown. Winthrop had made a little money doing mowing around town, but he never offered to go to Vanna's. I remember walking around the corner of the house when she didn't answer my knock, and the sun was right there, just low behind the woods, just blood red and big, going down. It looked so close. It was going behind the shed, which I noticed for the first time. I figured if she didn't answer, I'd check it out, and maybe the space heater would be in there and I could just take it. Everything was very quiet. I did wind up having to go to the shed. I slid the door open, and I looked inside. I slipped into a strange state when I saw what I saw. I guess I became unhinged. I remember that I walked out, and I had my hands up and out toward the sun, and I walked right towards it, like I was reaching for it, as if it could pull me away from what I saw. I went down on my knees, and I almost passed out, but I held on. And after a few minutes, things got clearer. I started running down the road.
Police in Erie County are investigating the suspicious death of Vanna Minter, a resident of Pontiac, who was found in her woodshed by a neighbor early yesterday evening. The 44-year-old woman had been savagely beaten and left sitting upright in a wicker chair. No arrests have been made, and now this small, quiet town is terrified that there might be a killer in their midst.
The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and neck, 3 blows in all. Based on lividity, it had occurred about 16 hours before the body was discovered, sometime around 3 in the morning. There wasn't much to go on from a physical evidence perspective. No weapon was found. The floorboards in the shed were very dirty, which we hoped would have given us a footprint, but what we found was kind of a muddled swirl of activity in the dust there, just leading us to believe that there had been a short struggle. It had taken place right there. So many of the prints were smeared and undefined that we thought it was possible that the assailant had only been wearing socks. There were some fibers found, but they matched such a generic type of sock, the kind that was sold all over the state, that they didn't help to identify anyone.
They came to talk to Winthrop a couple days after it happened. He hadn't reacted much to it at all when I told him what I'd found. He just had this quizzical look on his face, like he couldn't process the information. He asked me why anyone would want to do that to her. And I said I had no idea. Then he shook his head over and over again and went out to walk to the store for some things we needed. I think it was just a routine thing, them coming to talk to Winthrop, because I'd had to tell them he knew her too, and I had described his situation. They'd found out his time in the Army had been rough. He'd had a lot of fights there and been given a kind of discharge that wasn't honorable but wasn't quite dishonorable. When they found out from Denise about the time he went to her porch, they came back and took him in to question him a second time. He didn't have too much of an alibi for the night Vanna was killed, and that wasn't much of a help there. Next thing I knew, he was being charged.
Under questioning, the man was very calm, almost unusually so, but very, very vague in his responses, even about how he felt about Ms. Minter. He told us he might have been sleeping that night, but he couldn't remember all of it. He also didn't have any real explanation for why he'd gone to Denise Minotka's house. What was obvious was he had been out night after night, and he didn't even give the excuse of, well, I have insomnia. He couldn't really say why he went on these marathon walks other than he felt uncomfortable indoors, and his sleep had been affected by a lot of dreams about an accident he'd suffered in the Army, which had given him third-degree burns all up his left leg. In the end, it was one very minor, in my view, piece of evidence that seemed to tip the scales toward the DA deciding to prosecute, other than a fairly distant incident in the Army record where he'd very badly beaten someone in a bar fight. We had found, when we searched his room at Ms. Hershbergen's house, an oven mitt stuck in a drawer. A perfectly harmless thing, but one of our officers, Trey Bailey, had observantly noticed that it was the second half of a pear, the other of which he had noticed in Ms. Minter's kitchen. The wear patterns on both of them were the same. The accused had denied ever setting foot in that house, so why he was in possession of this item just seemed troubling.
I never even knew about the oven mitt till it was brought up at the trial. I didn't get to talk to him much at all because We couldn't raise bail, so he stayed in jail, which I think is what he wanted anyway. He was given a public defender, and I could have told him that maybe it had been part of a box of loose kitchen things she dropped off when I wanted to plan a yard sale the month before. I just didn't know. I didn't recall ever seeing it. But that doesn't mean it wasn't in there. Maybe Winthrop took it, who knows? He was a collector of things. Little things here and there that didn't have much meaning. We didn't talk about that kind of thing when I came to see him.
Gentlemen, put a shirt on. Step on out. Lunchtime. Get on the way back. Make sure you give me your name.
I remember thinking fairly quickly that there must have been a little desperation on the part of the prosecution, because so much of the evidence was very, very circumstantial. And I thought, I can win this case. I can win it if there's any sort of overreach. And I would say that overreach was actually absurd. He depicted Mr. Engel as this twisted killer, this night-stalking fiend practicing his movements in the dark before picking his first victim, when there was every chance that Vanna Minter's relationship with any number of men from the past pointed to any number of other possibilities.
He asked me to stay away while he was in jail. Not in a mean way. I sent him things. He never responded. I went every day of that trial. My boss let me rearrange my schedule, though sometimes I had to leave well before the end of the day, so there were some things that happened in court that I never knew about, I'm sure. I remember thinking how peaceful Winthrop looked sometimes. Not interested at all in what was going on around him, but sort of grateful almost that he didn't have any choices to make. He could just show up and sit for hours and not think about his life. No one else from the family came, except for maybe once.
I think Ms. Minotka was incredibly powerful. It was one of those show-stopping moments that you fear in a trial if you're on the wrong side. Her face and her voice when she described her terror at finding this man on her porch, for no reason. It really came through, as if she were describing a murder or some other terrible act that had already happened. The adjectives she used, her pauses, it was all so vivid. And worse still, it was totally honest. I really had some work to do before she left the stand. And I'm not sure how well I did. That was a tough day.
From the force of the blows, it seemed that the assailant was certainly very strong, unusually so. There was a lot of overkill in what he or she did, even though it was just 3 blows that could be proven. My gut was telling me that a man as passive as the one we arrested would not have gone over the top like that, but his past did tell us different, and I have learned that almost anyone is capable of it.
You could sort of tell by listening to people talk around here that everyone was focused on this one guy. But I was like, Jesus, I hope they got the right guy. Because if it's not him, you are all a bunch of fools staying out so late at night.
This was about a week before the trial started. I woke up sometime after midnight. I'd been having a lot of trouble sleeping. My habit was to get up and get a glass of weak tea and then go back to bed. I usually didn't even turn the lights on, but this time I did, just for a minute, and turned them back off again. When I got back to my bedroom, I looked out and I saw my car out there. I didn't have a driveway, so it just sat in the grass. And there was a shape behind it, next to the rear wheel. Something bulky there, really low. in the dark. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I was scared to even get closer to the window. It was too big to be an animal. And then it moved just a little. I sat back down on my bed because I was afraid to keep looking. I was trying to remember if the back door was locked, trying to visualize myself locking it, and when I would have done that. Finally, I looked out again. It was gone, whatever it was. But I never got back to sleep. I had to call in late to work. Every sound out there in the woods from then on was threatening to me.
So many times I've seen a case start to veer off the rails in court because of the presentation of blood evidence. It can get so detailed and so murky that you simply lose the jury's attention. And I think that started to happen. The prosecution was so intent on establishing the power of the assailant and the savagery of the attack through the blood patterns in the shed that he felt he had to go back and repeat that same theme all over again when I challenged the veracity of 2 of the samples, and when I brought up again how there was nothing else in existence with the victim's blood on it that could be connected to Mr. Engel. What you see happen with blood or fiber evidence is this endless back and forth battle of experts and discrediting and conjectures being raised and shot down, and in the end the jury's eyes glaze over. They just get confused about what the original point was, or if anyone knows exactly what they're doing.
I was sitting in the courtroom and I started having this memory of doing the laundry. It was sometime before Winthrop was arrested, but after, I think, they'd come to talk to him the first time. See, I would always do the laundry for both of us. And in there, in the pile one day, was one of his shirts. He only had about 4. This was a green shirt with the logo of a brewery on it. It was all twisted up and a little damp, like it had gone through the washer already. But I don't think he'd ever used the machine before. When I got home from court, I laid down and I prayed. I prayed that I misunderstood.
The trial of Winthrop Engel for the murder of Pontiac resident Vanna Minter ended today in a hung jury. After 3 days of deliberations, no definite verdict could be reached, and so Mr. Engel will go free after a 22-day trial. Prosecutors did not comment on whether he might be tried again at a later date before a new jury. Public defense attorney Nan Carlos said she would have preferred to see a full acquittal.
We don't feel the state had any specific evidence against Mr. Engel, and you saw whatever guesses they did have completely fall apart in the courtroom. I don't know where they got the confidence in their case, because it certainly didn't come from any known facts.
He had to go through a day of processing procedures before he was released. So I told him I'd come back for him to pick him up the next night if he called me. But it got very late and I fell asleep. He got a ride from the police. And when I heard him coming in, I couldn't bring myself to get up. I didn't know how to react, really, so I pretended I never heard him come in. I needed some time. I needed to sleep. And maybe when I woke up, I'd have a better idea of what to do next. Because I was afraid. I was finally afraid to be around him. But when I woke up, he was gone. He'd taken almost nothing with him. He left a note telling me that he thought it was better if he went to live somewhere else. And he'd gone. With no money. The guilt I felt over that was terrible. I took his note to mean he sensed how I felt somehow. Like I hadn't been able to hide it as well as I thought. If he was innocent, then what a tragedy that was. That the only person who would take him in had slowly become so cold.
Frightened of staying in her remote house alone, Ellen moved a month after the verdict to a small apartment in Silver Creek, 15 miles away. She was not contacted again by Winthrop. There had been no additional murders in the Pontiac area after his arrest.
I suppose because I'm not educated, I have very simple ideas about life, and especially the bad things that can happen to people. So I'd imagine that he was out there, homeless, dying somewhere of hunger. I doubted the family was helping him. And from what I knew of him, I just didn't know how he could manage on his own.
Oh, she called me around mid-November of 2015, I think it was. This was only 6 months after I was actually shot by a former client, so I was still on the fence about getting back into this line of work. But what she needed seemed fairly simple, so I said, sure, I can help you find your relative. She could have done it herself with about 3 phone calls, but in my experience, people like the sense of putting a distance between themselves and something they'd consider, let's use the term furtive. They like the sense of free will being given over to a professional. It's got a little absolution to it.
They told me he was spending time in a homeless shelter in Clarksburg. That was only about a 20-minute drive from Pontiac. I wrestled with myself for a few days about whether to go. I knew if I mentioned it to anyone, they'd tell me it was a reckless thing to do.
I assumed he was nonverbal when he came in, and that he couldn't read and write very well. That was okay. We had no problem with that whatsoever. We're ready for whatever needs someone might have.
I went in. He was sitting on a bed and looking through an atlas of the world from the little library they'd put together. It was so terrible, so strange that he wasn't saying anything. He had a notepad with him and a pencil, and he wrote hello, and he accepted a hug. But when I asked him if something had happened to his voice, he just wrote, "No, I am very hoarse." And he wrote it without an A, so it was just hoarse. So I felt very limited in what I could ask him. I gave him some money, which he took. And I said if he'd like to stay at the motel down the street, I would get a room for him for a couple nights. And he wrote yes. It was all one-word answers. And there wasn't anything too different from his usual, but it was more his eyes that bothered me. He wasn't looking at me the same way. He'd linger on me. I don't think he ever really stopped staring. I asked him to meet me in a couple days when his throat was a little better. I looked out the window and I saw McDonald's there across the street, and I told him to meet me there on Friday at 8 o'clock, after he'd left the motel, and we could talk some more. He nodded, and then I left. I thought that something had happened to him that he wasn't telling me. This wasn't the same person that had lived with me. I drove back when I was supposed to, on Friday night, and he was already there, waiting for me in a booth in the corner. We were pretty much alone. It was cold out. He still had the pad, though. I asked him if he was okay, if he'd seen a doctor, but he didn't answer that. All he'd done was write a sentence on the pad, and he pointed to it. It said, "Where does Grace Beck live?" I had no idea who that was, and I told him so, but he just pointed to it again. He still had his gloves on. He wouldn't take them off. Then it got to a point where he wasn't answering anything I asked. He just tapped the pad over and over and kept looking at me in a way he'd never looked at me before. This just wasn't the same person. I left him sitting there and got in my car, and I saw him go out through the other entrance. He started to walk down the road, but not in the direction of the shelter. So I tried to follow him. I couldn't just creep alongside him. That didn't work, so I'd drive past and then circle back and keep doing that, sort of keeping track of his progress down the road. He sat down in a bus shelter, and I knew I couldn't follow him further than that. I was at a stoplight, and when it turned green, I'd just move on. He was sitting there, and he took his gloves off. He still didn't see me. The shelter was one of those that has the fluorescent lights in it. And I saw that his fingernails were painted.
When they'd done their evidentiary, the police had found a series of letters Ms. Minter had written to an unidentified woman. The letters were incredibly angry and threatening, and they even slipped into a kind of deranged murder fantasy. She was vowing to kill this woman she was writing to and whom she'd had an affair with. But the details of who she was, those were incredibly vague, and none of the letters had been sent. I tried to get them introduced at trial to demonstrate that this opened the door to a potential suspect other than my client, but the prosecution pretty efficiently kept them out. Too speculative. Without having any idea who this target of her wrath was, there was no way to find her and question her, so it all collapsed.
I was teaching at Genesee Community College, and she was a student. I think she was taking maybe one class other than mine. She wasn't very serious. And she was fairly aggressive in her approach to me. And I was going through some dark things at the time, none of which I'm proud of. The intense part of the relationship lasted maybe a few weeks. And after that, after I sort of maneuvered out of it, she became unhinged very fast.
There was a knock on my door, and a man was standing out there. He was about 50, I'd say, and he said he represented the state of New York, and that there was some money owed to Winthrop, part of some legal settlement from a job he used to have. There weren't a lot of details, but they needed to find him, and I was connected to his last known address. I told him about the shelter and said maybe they could find him there, but I wasn't much help. And he went away. Something about that man didn't feel right at all. From the second he began talking, it didn't feel right. It didn't seem to me to be the way the state would go about things. The more I thought about it, that talk we had there in the doorway, the more frightened I got that I'd been speaking to someone who had a secret, someone who was using me. The fact that he was physically that close to me, this man, it was the same feeling I'd got from seeing that shape beside my car in the middle of the night, back in Pontiac. Some threat. He had never given me a card or any contact information.
Dear Miss Beck, you don't know me, but I'm sending this email because you might be acquainted with someone I know named Winthrop. He told me 2 weeks ago that he was looking for someone named Grace Beck, and I worried about this because of some changes to Winthrop's personality. Some people think he could be dangerous. I thought there was a chance he intends to harm this person. I looked up many Grace Becks in the area, but you are the only one who Winthrop might have a connection to. I see on LinkedIn that you were a teacher at Genesee Community College, where a neighbor of mine had some classes. Her name was Vanna. This is the only reason I thought you might be the Grace Beck he was talking about. I'm not sure what other information I can offer you. If you think you might be the right Grace Beck, feel free to write back and I can try to explain more. Ellen Hershbergen. I got that email in early December.
I let a long time go before the last time I tried to see Winthrop. Too long, probably. The people in the shelter told me he'd left a week before, and they had no idea where he'd gone to. So I was reduced to driving around town in the snow. I remember thinking that if it got even the tiniest bit heavy, well, I wouldn't go out that day. I was at the edge of the parking lot debating it, but I did go. Just driving around thinking there was only 1 in 1,000 chance I'd spot him. But it felt like the only way to close things.
I got physically afraid for myself when Vana started distorting some facts about our relationship. She would call my cell, and she would call me horrible names, but she would also accidentally call me by an entirely other name sometimes, which was really unsettling. Or she would talk about things I had supposedly told her in Texas, which was a place we'd never been. We'd never been there. So I really began to fear her. The attraction to an outlier personality, which I had succumbed to, that turned bad, and maybe some damaged part of me knew all along that it would. But I really wasn't prepared for someone like Vana.
I didn't think I had it in me to ask some of the other homeless people I saw about him. Winthrop was tough to describe. You know, it was the painted fingernails that finally reminded someone of him. This guy was maybe 20 years old, a very nice young black guy who seemed out of place there on the street. He was so polite, more like a student. But he was homeless too. He told me to check out a park nearby. Some people slept there, and he thought Winthrop might. He didn't know his name, but he knew about the fingernails. The man he'd talked to just one time could speak, though, so I thought maybe he was mistaken. I went to the park. It was very big and woodsy. The only way you could see it all was by going down a trail that went through the woods. So I walked. It was very cold. And I came out at this field that was separated from me by a creek. I was standing right here, about half a football field away from the creek over there, and someone was standing watching me on the other side of it. I could see his face, and it was Winthrop. But he was wearing a dress, like an old one. He was wearing a wig. So I started to walk toward him, and he shouted at me from where he was. He said, "Stay back, bitch, or I'll kill you too." I turned and started to walk back in this direction. I was already crying. And I heard him yell at me to find Grace Beck and bring her here. I ran then.
In one of the letters threatening this anonymous woman, Ms. Minder had talked about how she would practice on her neighbor, by which she very obviously meant killing her. She was very specific about the means. She would strangle her as she slept. Now, she could have meant one of several people, but my first thought was that she was talking about Ellen Hershbergen. She didn't date the letters, but you could see that there was an escalation happening, and that Ms. Minter's rage seemed to reach its height very shortly before her own murder. Something was about to happen. She finally wrote why she wasn't sending these letters. She intended to leave them on her anonymous ex-lover's body after she had dismembered her.
Quite frankly, we thought we might have had the seed of a motive. That at some point the accused had somehow gleaned a threat to the woman who was taking care of him and had been set off. We just didn't have enough evidence, and quite frankly, I thought it would have been just too risky to gamble on that one delicate thread.
When things were still somewhat in control and I thought I could talk her down, as it were, before I had to leave and I had to move from my apartment to try to escape her. There was an incident I still don't understand. I've tried not to think about it. I confronted her about her lies concerning where she actually lived. It turned out the place I had once visited her was not her house at all. In fact, I'd begun to suspect that she might have been squatting in various places without ever really having an address. And in the middle of the argument, I remember we were walking behind an antique store outside of town. She turned to me and said, no matter what happens, I know how to live forever. I was taught by Porta-John Man. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said that ever since she was a little girl, she had dreams of a Porta-John sitting in the middle of a cornfield. And sometimes a man would pop out from behind it and he would tell her how to live forever. He would explain the process to her. So she learned it, she said, and even if she died, she wouldn't really be dead. I became truly afraid of her. Nothing I'd read in my life explained her mind.
I called Grace Beck on the phone. She was very nice. I told her what I could and tried to make a little sense of it. And I offered to drive out and see her, and she said that was a good idea. She'd had to rearrange her whole life when she got so scared of Vanna. She'd applied for a job somewhere else and moved away.
I told her that I would meet her at my house at 9 o'clock. I had to drive back from the city. I told her if I was late at all, she could go right into the house and wait, since it would be very cold. I never locked my back door, but now, of course, that would have to change. And as I got into my car, I found myself fixated on the situation and becoming more and more frightened, and I started to shut down. I began to panic. It was a combination of the memories of Vanna, plus this new threat, this accused murderer who I'd heard about on the news singling me out, and it just gave me this horrible, unreal feeling of almost vertigo.
I don't have a cell phone, so I waited in her drive. At about 9:45, I got out of my car and went into the house like she'd asked me to. I couldn't keep my engine running for the heat for that long. It felt very strange to be alone in there. Only about 10 minutes after I got in and sat down in the living room, I heard a dog barking outside. It was barking very loud and long, and then it stopped. For a second, I thought that it was barking at me, a trespasser. I lay back and closed my eyes for just a minute.
I realized I'd driven past my exit, but I did nothing about it. I kept driving and driving, exit after exit, and I stopped looking at the clock or the gas tank. I just kept going. Each exit that came up, I couldn't bring myself to take it. I was running away. Anywhere was better than home.
Suddenly, I heard the back door being pulled on very hard, over and over again. There was no knock. It was just all at once this sound of the wood rattling, like someone was trying to rip it off its hinges. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. I got up, and I went into the hallway. I could see the kitchen from there, and the door. I went to the window. Grace had a big backyard with a floodlight, and I saw 2 men running toward the house across it, toward the back door. I screamed. I don't know if they heard me or not, but they were already splitting off on both sides of the house. One was going to the left, one was going to the right. No one would have seen them. The house was screened off by trees. Then I heard something moving on the roof. I backed into the hallway so fast I wasn't watching where I was going, and I slammed my hand into the wall and I broke my thumb. I heard something from the front of the house, something hitting the gutter. Looking through the living room window, I saw one of the men come around the front. He was looking up at the roof and yelling something to the other man. I could tell then that I wasn't the reason they were there. Then whoever was up there on the roof jumped off it. I had some strange burst of bravery, and I opened the front door. These two men were pinning Winthrop to the ground. He was wearing women's clothes. This van pulled up at the curb very fast, and they were pulling Winthrop toward it. A woman got out the front of it, and she came running up to me, and she pushed a card into my hand and told me that I should call the number on the card as soon as they were gone. They forced Winthrop into the back of the van, and it closed, and they drove away. No headlights on. It had all happened in about 30 seconds. I was left with this card in my hand. It had a phone number written on it and a first name, James. In the dirt near the front door, there was a hatchet. They'd taken it away from Winthrop when they took him down.
This is the book. This is the 6th dictionary of occult manifestation. Only 4 copies exist in the world today. This one was stolen from the University of Heidelberg about 10 years after it was printed in 1832. I could go to jail for this, obviously, which is another reason you're not recording this. And I'm not using my name. And I can't answer any questions about where this came from. Good. The phenomenon that Ms. Hershbergen is talking about has only been referenced one time in print, and it's in here. The terminology is archaic, so, of course, the term lockbox is nowhere in here. But the case of Catalina Popa is fairly well described, and if you take that case, almost 300 years old now, and draw a parallel between it, right, and the case of this man Ms. Hershbergen describes, you can do it. It's pretty clear. Again, we're just starting here. I want you to see the grounding.
I suppose that if I hadn't had such a traumatic time with the police back when Winthrop was arrested and during the trial, then I would have thought about calling them first. Of course I would have. Not that they'd done anything wrong. They had always been just doing their jobs. But I felt safer somehow calling the number on the card first. The man named James answered, and he told me that Winthrop was very safe. He was under the observation of a doctor, but also some other people who had his best interest in mind. They wanted to talk to me because they were aware of who I was and that I had a concern for Winthrop too, and that he was happy to meet me any place I liked, but confidentiality was very important. So I went to the bandstand at the park, and he was waiting for me.
And I want to try to read this without touching the pages. Ms. Popa, a deaf woman prone to visions and hallucinations, took gravely ill in September of 1730 at the home of her father and later disappeared. In spring of 1732, she was found by a cousin being cared for at Pomposa Abbey, Emilia-Romagna. Ms. Popa was uncommunicative, yet words issued from her mouth in a whisper every moment she was conscious. It was noted that she was reciting the monologues of more than a dozen individual overlapping personalities, sentences blurred into one another without meaning. The prelate of Emilia-Romagna, Lucio Trentini, after spending days transcribing her words, was asked if the poor wretch should submit to the process of exorcism. He replied, "To the contrary, we must make every effort to keep these demons inside of her."
The first thing James asked me there at the bandstand was if I had noticed something odd about Winthrop's behavior in the courtroom during his trial, if anything had stood out. And something did occur to me. He would sometimes do this thing where he'd run his hands up his face, feeling the skin. Not like scratching an itch, just like compulsively feeling his face, almost exploring it. James said yes, that is what he and the people he worked with had responded to. They had read about this behavior on a reporter's blog, and they started to go to the trial every day. They had been sitting near me all along. I was never aware of it, but they were there. Before James went on talking, he said he wanted me to accept a different way of thinking about the world from that moment on. He said it might be helpful if I imagined I was a character in a movie that was going on all around me, and that I should try to react to any twist like a movie character would, not resisting it. He said that only in that way would I be able to accept the things he needed to tell me, and I could maybe save Winthrop. He made it sound like no one else could. It was me.
Imagine a person whose mind and body have been completely hollowed out, either through an accident of birth or abuse, probably a combination of both. In particular, think of the effects of long-term drug abuse, heroin, methamphetamine. Imagine all that striking someone whose mind is already malformed. What you get is a kind of empty human shell. In that shell, there can be no spiritual resistance. It represents infinite space for an infinite number of intruding malevolent spirits. Now, this is not an unfamiliar concept, but what if that shell had a pragmatic use?
He asked me if I was willing to believe Vanna was inside Winthrop, like he did, like the people he worked with did. And I said I didn't know, but that I'd try. I'd try to be like a movie character, not try to fight it if it made me safe. He said they needed me to confirm what they suspected, that I was the only one who'd been around him enough who could fill in the information they were missing. There were dozens and dozens of questions they had, and if they were able to convince me, would I be willing to accept the process of saving him, even if it was dangerous? I didn't know that either. He must have talked to me for 2 hours. By the end, everything about life was mysterious to me. Even his explanation of who these people were sounded like it was invented. Scholarly people and doctors and religious people, he said, but not priests. He couldn't say how many there were, or even where they had come from.
A malevolent spirit wants one thing more than causing harm, which is to find a safe, dark place where it can live forever. It has the same survival instincts as we do ourselves, and the same fight or flight capacities. It wants to sequester itself away. It's looking for the opportunity. Okay?
I think this was the place. But it's so tough to tell. I recognized a landmark back at the bridge. Oh, but was this the right road? I don't know. There was a blue house on a hill in the country, about 20 miles away from the park. It even had blue shutters and a blue door. But it looked very old and forgotten. James took me there. He said Winthrop was there too. And I asked him if I could see him. He took my hand and he shook his head very sadly. He said, with the way Vanna had tried to get him to change himself just in the last few hours, it might be too traumatic to see him as he was now. The woman who had driven the van was there too. And I heard someone moving on the floor above me, and a voice. The questions they asked me were very strange. The point of it was to, I don't know what the word is, to make a baseline. A baseline of Winthrop's physical habits, how I'd seen them, the way he moved and sat and ate. They needed to understand how different he'd been from what they were seeing now. It was very late when they were through talking to me. They still hadn't given me any details on how they intended to treat him. I had the sense that they didn't know how to describe it to me without scaring me very badly. It went on for hours, felt like. At one point, they brought me food, Chinese food that a man I hadn't seen yet had gone out for. Then I was left alone to sleep. James wanted me to sleep, and I slept on a thin bed in an upstairs room. I had a dream about a fire. The creek going through that field, the creek where I saw Winthrop, was all flames. James came to wake me. It was almost 9 o'clock then. He explained that they only knew of one way to bring Winthrop back. Vana had to go somewhere else, to another body. He said there was probably only one person in the whole country who could be that person, who could be that host. Because it couldn't be anyone who could physically harm someone else. And it couldn't be anyone with a mind strong enough to resist her. He was being brought there that night. There was nothing to do but wait.
Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. For by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. And so we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Let us now sing.
A car pulled up around 11. I went to the window and looked down at the driveway. It was a van. They were taking someone out of it, lifting a wheelchair down. Because it was so cold, whoever it was wrapped in a blanket. But the wind was whipping up and moved the blanket away for a second. And I saw as they wheeled him into the porch light. It was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 9. I've never seen a little boy who looked so pale. His eyes weren't the eyes of a living person, but he was alive. James came back up from the basement and sat with me. And so did 2 other people.
No one's ever seen what happens when a lockbox is left alone in a room with a possessed person. Whatever happens, it happens only when no eyes are watching. It doesn't matter if it's a human being or a camera. We don't know what kind of confrontation that is. We can't know. The doors close, and then the waiting begins.
They didn't know how many spirits had been drawn into that little boy, but it was at least 20. They would only tell me that this was the only way he could be.
My guess would be that his parents were long gone and that his body was an absolute void, a wasteland, likely created by an addiction to some very powerful drug, or drugs. And of course, the most obvious way he would have become addicted was through the parents, the mother or the father. My guess is that there was only one. Remember what I told you, I've only laid eyes on one person of the kind we're talking about, and she was in a medically induced coma. It was the only thing keeping her alive.
I refused to be taken out of there, though they wanted me to go. They said it might be dangerous. They couldn't know what sort of power the boy contained, what kind of chaos went on inside him. It might erupt someday, or cohere. Or maybe the things that were trapped inside him might begin to somehow cooperate with each other. They knew of only 4 people like him in the world. I said, "Where does he live?" Nobody answered me. All night, while we waited there in the upstairs room, there wasn't a sound. Except just one time, around 2 a.m, maybe a little before that, I was lying down. There were 2 people with me sitting nearby, just waiting with me. And through the vent, you could hear something. Someone was laughing in a very cruel way. One short burst of laughter, then it was gone. There was literally not another sound all night from that basement. Maybe 3 a.m. was when they called for James to go back there. He went and came back, and he said it was okay if I wanted to go down and see Winthrop. We went down into this basement. There was absolutely nothing in it but 2 chairs facing each other across the room. Winthrop was standing there looking at me. He said, "Hello," like he used to, the same way. Whenever he used to say that word, it was like he was trying out what it felt like to be friendly. Like he was afraid it might turn against him somehow. That was how he sounded. He was Winthrop again. The little boy was gone, but the van was still outside. So he was still there somewhere I couldn't see. There was a door at the edge of the basement. I thought, if they took me through it, that's where he'd be. But of course they never did. Someone took us home. Winthrop looked out the window as we drove. He never really took his eyes off the trees going by and the farms. And I had a sense then that he'd be with me again for a long time, because there really was no other way. I couldn't imagine any other way for him. It was my cross to bear.
This is a woman of profound kindness, a woman who offers her friendship with no conditions. Some of the most loving people on this earth still set limits on who receives it and under what circumstances. That's a natural human inclination. I myself can't even overcome it. But she has no wall. Think about how many people you've known who have that capacity in your whole life. I mean, is it 2 or 3? This is the kindness of saints.
At about 5:10 a.m. on December 21st, there was a fire call at 108 High Birch Lane. By the time we arrived, the house was pretty well engulfed. No possibility of saving anything. To let you know how bad the damage was, it was a blue house with a blue trim and even a blue door. But it was only a month later through forensic analysis that the color could be scientifically determined. So complete was the disintegration, which is very unusual. We recovered 5 bodies from the fire, but the cause itself couldn't be determined. The 5 bodies were all adults, none of whom were found to live in the area. A half-mile away was the 6th body, or should I say, bodies. This was Reginald Post, age 55, a ramp serviceman for United Airlines, retired, who had been out walking his dog. They were both burned, almost to nothing, lying there on the side of the road. Mr. Post was probably killed sometime while the fire at the house was just beginning to take hold. The only witness who could offer anything was a motorist who saw a small boy walking in the dark from the general direction of the house and along the same general path that Mr. Post took from his own home. We searched for that boy. We hoped he might have seen something, but we never found him.
In March of 2018, Winthrop Engel left the home of his distant relative, Ellen Hershbergen, after more than 18 months of only intermittent employment, but no arrests and no further incidents with neighbors. He went to live with the family of an old Army friend and worked as a small engine mechanic. That Christmas, he made for Ellen a wooden nativity set as a gift and sent it to her through the mail.